Some years ago, the Atlanta station WSB used to feature a program called Mystery Theater, in which they'd feature stories like the story of John Brown, and he was one of the stories they featured. But Mystery Theater was unpopular with most Atlantans, and the station got rid of the show. He had 20 children by his first wife died, so he married again. He had not been successful in anything he attempted. But in 1856, he slaughtered 5 men at Pottawatomie, Kansas, because he believed that they were pro-slavery. Now, this was tricky because Kansas and Nebraska were two separate territories. Nebraska was obviously Nebraska had no slaves in it at all. It was completely free of slaves. But Kansas was north of the line that divided the slave from the free according to the Missouri Compromise. In other words, according to the Missouri Compromise, this was to be the boundary. Slavery was to be allowed here. Well, Kansas was north of this line. But a lot of persons in Kansas wanted there to be slavery, but the people who lived here, some of them didn't. So there was a big issue with Kansas, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. John Brown decided to take matters into his own hands and kill 5 people. He then went east, went to Maryland, captured the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Maryland, but he was defeated and hung for treason. He had believed that once he started his military operation, once he captured this arsenal, the slaves would rise up and then a war would follow. Now, he's not the last man to try to start a race war. Charles Manson, who killed the actress Sharon Tate and a few others, he was also trying to start a race war. This was in 1969, but in Brown's case, it was in the 1850s. But he believed that the slaves would rise, but the slaves were afraid to rebel, so they didn't. Southerners began to say that Northerners were trying to incite their slaves to rebellion. A man named David Wilmot introduced a bill to prohibit slavery from any territory that might be required for the war. His reasoning was that the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, did not account for these territories that would be taken from Mexico, and therefore that the Missouri Compromise was not valid. Again, the Missouri Compromise had said that territories here, that included Louisiana and Arkansas, should be slave, but then these territories were Mexican at the time, and they were not to, Lewis Cass's view was they should not count as part of the compromise. And keep in mind, at the time in 1820, we did not own this territory either. It was in dispute with Great Britain. And as we will find out soon, the Missouri Compromise was repealed. The South was angry. Slavery was to divide the country as no other issue had. Now, Congress had faced the issue of slavery quite a bit before this time. They had outlawed slavery in Ohio, made it legal in Louisiana. In the case of Missouri, Congress had allowed part of it. Missouri, for the most part, was a slave state, especially after Maine came in as a free. But then we acquired all this territory from Mexico in 1845. And Congress had to decide the slavery issue, and the debate about this slavery in this newly conquered territories was to continue throughout the 1850s. To make a long story short, Congress was never to resolve it. As I think a lot of you know, hopefully most of you know, it was not resolved until the country had fought a long, 4-year-long civil war that killed some 600,000 men. And then the issue was finally resolved. All right. Now, Mexico, before we took their territory from Mexico, had gotten their independence in 1821. They had outlawed slavery in the territories that they held. California, New Mexico, and what we call Arizona today. Mexico had outlawed slavery in these territories, but then in 1836, Texas broke away from Mexico, and they allowed slavery because a lot of them were Southern. So, and then the issue is what to do about slavery in New Mexico, the New Mexico Territory, the Arizona Territory. That was still up in the air. Well, now, a lot of Northerners favored the Wilmot Proviso that said slavery should be outlawed in the Mexico Territory. Some of the Northerners were genuinely against slavery, but other Northerners feared that the Democrats might die out, the Whigs would become the dominant party in the North. And they did not like this because the Whigs would not come out against the expansion of slavery, which a lot of Northerners wanted. And they also feared that if slavery were made legal, the South would pick up votes in the U.S. House of Representatives. Then, of course, there are other issues. I mean, slavery was not the only issue. There was the issue of banking, internal improvements, in other words, road building, canal building, railroad building, and the tariff. All these separated the North from the South also, but nothing quite like the slavery issue. The slavery issue was the hot issue that actually ultimately broke up the Union. Most of your white men, whether they were Northerners or Southerners, did not want to work shoulder to shoulder with black men. Again, it was a case of racial prejudice that the Northern people were guilty of as much as were the Southern people. Now, in the House of Representatives, where the Northern representatives greatly outnumbered the Southern ones, as I've tried to be already told you, the North got far more immigrants and Northern families are bigger than Southern. So the North had a lot more people. The Wilmot Proviso passed in the House. In the Senate, Calhoun, John Calhoun from South Carolina, said that Congress had no right to keep a slave owner from moving to territory and taking his slaves with him. So the slave states outnumbered the free 15-14. Therefore, the Senate did not pass the proviso. Some moderates wanted to divide the territories, with the northern parts being free and the southern parts being slave. Again, they were trying to work out an agreement. And if we had lived back then, folk, we might have taken some of the same sides that they did. Now, you might wonder, were there people around who believed that there should be no slavery at all and that all slavery was wrong? Yes, there were, but they were looked on in those days as being extreme. Only the moderates had a chance to become president. Only the moderates had a chance to get ahead in politics. Your extremists did not get far in politics. 1848, Congress ended its session. No plan had been adopted. The Wilmot Proviso did not pass. In short, nothing was done. 1848 was a presidential election year. President Polk was too sick and said he refused to have his name considered. He said he was not going to run again. So the Democrats chose Lewis Cass. Cass is a name you hear about. One time he ran for president once and lost, and you don't hear much about him again. The Whigs realized, they'd lost with Henry Clay 3 times. So they decided to try a general, Zachary Taylor. Their first general, William Henry Harrison, only lasted 1 month. Now, ironically, Zachary Taylor won the election, but he only lasted 1 year. But anyway, the Whigs nominated a general. The Whigs did not adopt a party platform. No, they did not tell the country what they believed. They just simply put out a general, and because he was popular. The Democrats did not come out clearly on the issue of slavery in the territories either. So in this lack of, these people were playing politics. In other words, you take a stand, you lose voters. Take a stand and lose voters. So, the Free Soil Party came along. It called for an end to slavery. It was extreme. It nominated former President Martin Van Buren. They did not get one electoral vote, did not carry one state. But they did get a lot of votes, not electoral vote, but the major parties were shaken because for the first time, a party had come on the scene that was actually anti-slave, and as I mentioned, it did not win. All right. Now, in the case of California, gold was discovered in California in 1848. In 1849, thousands of men went to California to hunt for gold. Some of them went by covered wagon or a horse straight across through Arizona and New Mexico. Some of them took the Isthmus of Panama, went by boat to the Isthmus of Panama, crossed over the mountains in Panama, and then went by boat, by ship up to California. And some of them went all the way around to South America to get to California that way, but they rushed to California. California had no law and order, and they realized we need law. To get law, we have to have a real constitution. So anyway, they set up a constitution and sent the constitution to Washington to be approved. The problem was their constitution was very anti-slave. You know, California had this people who were against slavery outnumbered the ones who were for it by a big, big margin. And there was no chance that California was going to come in as a slave state. It was a completely free territory. But anyway, California was not allowed into the Union right away. President Taylor wanted to admit both California and New Mexico to the Union, and this upset Southerners. Now here's why. Zachary Taylor was a Southerner himself. He was from Louisiana. He owned 300 slaves. He was wealthy, a large plantation owner, cotton grower, and everybody thought, well, he'll be one of us. Folk, a lot of times you appoint a man to a position and he doesn't turn out to be what you thought he'd be. A lot of presidents appointed Supreme Court justice, and when they get him in office, that justice is not at all what we thought he'd be. And the same thing with presidents. It was said that Hitler, some people put him in thinking they could control him, and once he got in, he controlled. But in the case of Taylor, he was a Southerner. The Southerners became upset at him. Calhoun said, "It looks as though the South cannot stay in the Union." Now, there were three men who called the triumvirate: Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. Webster, Clay, and Calhoun. Anyway, Henry Clay had worked out compromises before. So, by the way, all three of these men were very old. None of them lived to see the year 1852. And Calhoun was so feeble that they had to carry him into the Senate chamber on a stretcher, and his speeches were read by one of his trusted aides. Now, if you go to Washington and take the tour, they'll show you the Senate chamber where this was debated. It's not where the Senate meets today. In those days, there were only 24 states in the Union and not 50. The Senate was smaller. The Senate chamber was smaller then than it is now. But anyway, these representatives, senators hammered out an agreement. Henry Clay's plan proved to be the only plan that had any chance of success. Don't try to memorize all 5 parts, but just basically know that the plan called for California being admitted as a free state. That went to the north. But for the South, they were told the rest of the southern of the territories would be admitted without restrictions on slavery. Now, folks, this did not actually happen because, again, a big war occurred 11 years later. Texas would have its debts taken over the federal government. This would get Texas out of debt, but they'd have to give up a bunch of their land. Texas would still be the biggest state until Alaska was admitted. Now, Washington. They would allow slavery in the city, but a lot of representatives and senators and Washington dignitaries were really embarrassed because a lot of foreigners would come to Washington, ambassadors. Ambassadors from places like Argentina and Chile and Ecuador and Mexico who had outlawed slavery, and they would see slaves being sold on the auction block, and also ambassadors from Great Britain and France who had outlawed slavery, ambassadors from Prussia, they'd outlawed slavery, ambassadors from Italy, they'd outlawed slavery. So all these ambassadors were coming into Washington, and they'd see slaves being traded. It was a terrible embarrassment, so they said, let's outlaw the slave trade, at least in Washington, but let's not outlaw the slavery itself. Then the fugitive slave law, this favored the South, say that Southerners had a right to catch their runaway slaves and bring them back. But Taylor opposed the compromise. Both sides had the people on both sides who opposed it. I mean, again, it gave each side a little bit. The South got some, the North got some. And a compromise, nobody's really happy because everybody has to give in a little. Calhoun said a compromise is impossible. The Union cannot hold together. And it couldn't as long as it remained partly slave. Daniel Webster spoke for compromise. He said that if the Southern states left the Union, secession would mean civil war. I don't know how he knew that, but it turns out he was right. Well, they put this together in one big package known as the word omnibus means all. They put all 5 bills in one big package known as the omnibus bill. The bill went down in defeat. Well, Senator Douglas had presented the bill as a whole. He presented the bill not as a whole, but as separate bills. And each provision would be debated individually and reworded in a form that could pass. So what happened? Taylor opposed all of it, but after 1 year in office, Zachary Taylor died suddenly. He died, he had stomach cramps, and we think his doctors killed him, and a lot of doctors killed patients in those days. There was a rumor that went around some 20 years ago that Taylor had been poisoned, so they actually dug up his body, but they found no evidence of poisoning, so he was probably killed by his doctors. Anyway, Taylor died suddenly. The Vice President Millard Fillmore took office. The Congress gave the bills to Millard Fillmore as separate bills, 5 bills, and they're known as the Compromise of 1850. They were debated on individually and passed, worded in a way such that they could pass. And this created a 10-year solution to the problems facing the nation. 10 years, the compromise worked, and then everything fell apart. Actually, the compromise really created more problems than it solved. Particularly, a lot of runaway slaves went to New England, where they knew the people there were strongly anti-slave. But the New Englanders were reluctant to give up the slaves who had run to them for freedom. And a lot of slaves went on to Canada, where their descendants are still there. And once in Canada, of course, there was nothing the Southerners could do to get them back. The Fugitive Slave Law Act, it allowed masters to cross borders, to cross state lines, to go to get their slaves, but some states enacted laws that somewhat protected slaves. President Millard Fillmore enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, let Southern slave owners go after their slaves. A lot of Northerners aided the runaway slaves, and Southerners were furious. They said, that's our property and it's not yours. All whites were expected to participate in the returning of runaway slaves. And all a slave owner had to do was state that a certain black was his property. But a lot of Northerners were reluctant to do that. A lot of slaves peacefully returned to their owners, but sometimes slaves were rescued and not allowed to be returned. They were hidden away or sent to Canada. New Englanders saw a lot of their black neighbors sent back to the South as slaves, and they became more anti-slave than ever. What also helped fuel the fires of slavery, or anti-slavery, was the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a woman, she was a Northerner who had never been south, never seen a plantation, wrote a novel. Southerners hated the book and wouldn't allow it to be sold. Northerners praised it. The book was made into a play and put on many stages. It was about a slave named Uncle Tom and how badly he was treated. Some say it's exaggerated, but the book Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most sold book other than the Bible. The most sold book from the time it was written until the year 1900. You can still find it if you look. You can. It's in some library still. My two daughters read it while they were growing up. My son did not. Other writers talked hard against slavery. Former slaves spoke up. All right. 1852. The Democrats and Whigs tried to get votes from both North and South. Now, by 1856, the Whig Party was dead, and the newly formed Republican Party did not even try to get Southern votes. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But in 1852, both parties tried to get votes from both sides. The Democrats chose Franklin Pierce. Now, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, all three of these presidents in the 1850s, were Northern men with Southern sympathies. They call these men doughface. All right, what's a doughface? Northern man, but who has Southern, who believes is the way Southerners do. So by being a Northern man, he would get the Northern votes. But having Southern sympathies, he'd get the Southern votes. The strategy worked. The Whigs had a hard time choosing, but finally chose Scott. Henry Clay was now deceased. They were hoping to win with a general. They'd won with a general in 1840. They'd won with a general in 1848. But General Scott was hopelessly divided. One book I read said Scott was like knifed in the back, stabbed in the back by his own party. The Whigs never put up another candidate for president. They did put up a few candidates for the House and Senate, but never put up another one for president. And most of their people wound up forming a new party called the Republican Party, the party of today. All right, Franklin Pierce, the next president, doughface man. He turned his attention away from slavery temporarily. All right, I got to back up for Franklin Pierce a little bit. He had served in the Senate, but he left the Senate because his wife did not like Washington. When they nominated him for president, his wife was hoping against hope that he would lose. He won the election anyway. And on his way to Washington, coming from New Hampshire, he was a Northerner, his wagon turned over and one of his sons was killed. Killed instantly when the wagon turned over. Pierce, though, went on to Washington after burying his son, and he never recovered from it. And also, the whole time he was there, his wife just hated Washington, and Pierce became probably the most drunken president we ever had, drinking his troubles down. I mean, I think I ought to throw this in because he goes down in history as a very ineffective leader. He had his eyes on Cuba. So some Americans tried to take Cuba, but that failed. Now, folk, this was not to be the last time. In 1961, a bunch of Americans went to Cuba to take Cuba from Fidel Castro, and they failed. But in 1857, a bunch of Americans went to Cuba to take it, and they failed. Cuba then Pierce tried to buy Cuba, but it did not work. The Spanish would not sell it, so Pierce suffered a big defeat in his attempt to get Cuba. However, one thing he did get, and it was the only territory he acquired, even though he wanted more. There's some people who wanted to build a railroad down here, so Ambassador Gadsden purchased a little bit of land, narrow strip of land from Mexico called the Gadsden Purchase. and we purchased it for something like $25 million, and it was called conscience money, because we felt like we had done the Mexicans wrong, and therefore we needed to, to give them some money to make things right. But the express purpose of put a railroad, eventually the railroad was put down in here. You might wonder, why couldn't they put it here? Because the Rocky Mountains made putting a railroad difficult. But there were places here where there were gaps, and they thought they could put a railroad down here. But the Northerners objected to that, saying, hey, a railroad this far south would just promote slavery in the South. So the railroad had to wait several years before it was actually built, but eventually one was. Stephen Douglas wanted a railroad also, but he wanted a railroad that would start in Chicago. And the railroad would start in Chicago and take the northerly route. Well, the problem with that is such a railroad would have to pass through Indian territory. Douglas' solution was simple: drive the Indians from that territory and make that territory the territory of Nebraska. Congress considered driving the Indians out of their permanent reserve, quote unquote permanent. But the Nebraska territory would be part of the territory that the Missouri Compromise said would be free. Well, again, folks, just by way of those of you who can't picture it, this is Nebraska. Chicago is here. A northern railroad starting in Chicago, but Douglas was from Illinois, a northern railroad starting from Chicago would pass through right here, this Indian territory of Nebraska. Basically what it meant was that Kansas and Nebraska would be split in two territories. Well, according to the Missouri Compromise, this territory should be free. But Douglas said, let's repeal the Missouri Compromise and allow slavery in here. It didn't work because nobody in Nebraska wanted slavery. But at least this was to satisfy the South and get Southern voters. Douglas had his eyes on the White House. And he felt like, to get to the White House, I need to do something to satisfy the South. Now, in reality, though, Nebraska did not ever have slaves, or not any significant amount of them. Now, in the case of Kansas, slavery became a really explosive issue in the state of Kansas, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, folk this is not the main part of the story, but I want to tell it anyway. Mary Todd made up her mind she was going to be First Lady. She was courted by Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. Now, any woman in her right mind who wanted to be First Lady would have gone with Stephen Douglas. Lincoln was somewhat unattractive and uncouth and awkward. Douglas had his act together. He was elected time and time again to the Senate. Instead, Mary Todd chose to marry Abraham Lincoln, and she got to be First Lady. Stephen Douglas never got to be president. Douglas and Lincoln, though, had been friends when they were young, but they eventually parted ways. All right. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. It was to divide the state of Kansas, the territory of Kansas, two territories, the territory of Kansas and the territory of Nebraska, and both of them were to be slave, except for one thing. Nebraska never had any slaves. So whether slavery was legal or not, Nebraska didn't have them. As for Kansas, according to the Missouri Compromise, it was supposed to be free. But for the first time in a long time, two parties emerged that were geographic. In other words, the Democrats became primarily Southern, and the Republicans the Northern Party. For a while, the Democratic Party was the only national party, but Northern Democrats were defeated badly. So then, like I said, the Democratic Party became more of a Southern party. It was to remain that way for a long time. Now, as Americans began to search for party affiliations, they began to form two parties, the Know-Nothings and Republicans. The Know-Nothings patterned themselves out of the Masons. They met in secret, and they wouldn't tell what they did. Now, folk, your book does not even mention the Masons hardly, but the fact is, most of our presidents were Masons. George Washington was a Mason, Ben Franklin was a Mason, Alexander Hamilton was a Mason. The Masons did a whole lot to write our Constitution, and the reason we have an electoral college was it was patterned after the Masons. But anyway, back to the